The air was heavy with incense and sorrow in the small medieval village of Blackwood. The people of the town gathered in the square beneath the tall stone church, its bells tolling a slow, mournful rhythm. Black cloaks draped the shoulders of the villagers, hoods pulled low against the cold, gray wind. It was the funeral of Elder Rowan, a man who had lived long, guided the people, and commanded respect through his wisdom. His passing weighed heavily on all, and the ceremony reflected the deep solemnity of the occasion. Among the crowd stood a young woman of 20 years, with braided brown hair and a rustic woolen gown dyed in muted shades of green and beige. Her name was Eleanor. Known throughout the village for her spirited laughter and playful nature, she was often admired for her liveliness, though some whispered that she lacked the seriousness expected of a woman her age. On this day, however, all were expected to be somber, silent, and reverent. The priest, robed in black with a golden cross gleaming against his chest, began to chant the prayers for Rowan's soul. The crowd bowed their heads. The heavy silence pressed like a stone against every heart. And then it happened. A muffled giggle escaped Eleanor's lips. At first, she tried to suppress it, biting her cheek, but the harder she resisted, the stronger it grew. Within moments, her shoulders shook, and laughter burst forth, echoing across the solemn square like an arrow piercing still water. The villagers froze. Eyes widened. The priest faltered in his chant. A grieving widow clutched her chest as if struck by a blade. All heads turned toward Eleanor, who now stood with her hand over her mouth, but the damage had been done. The air, once filled with reverence, now burned with outrage. "How dare she?" someone hissed. "She mocks the dead," cried another. "Shameful," a voice shouted, trembling with fury. The laughter had died on her lips as quickly as it had come. Eleanor's face flushed red, her heart pounding. I didn't mean it," she stammered, but the crowd's anger rose like fire catching in dry straw. The widow of Elder Rowan fell to her knees, tears streaking her face. "Disrespect. In the name of my husband's spirit, disrespect," she cried out. The priest raised his hand, his voice deep with condemnation. "This is no place for mockery. She has dishonored the dead before the eyes of God and man. Such insolence cannot go unpunished." Eleanor shook her head desperately. "Please, it was a mistake. I don't know why, but her pleas fell into the cold, judging silence. The village headman, Lord Cedric, stepped forward. He was a stern figure, draped in a heavy robe of dark wool, his gray beard marking him as a man of years and authority. His eyes narrowed as he studied Eleanor, who trembled under his gaze. "Eleanor of Blackwood," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the square, "you have disgraced this sacred gathering. You have mocked the soul of a great man, insulted his family, and brought shame upon our traditions. Such insolence demands retribution." The crowd murmured in approval, their voices blending into one grim chorus. Eleanor's heart sank. "The sentence," Cedric continued, "is public caning, here in the square, before the eyes of those you have disrespected. May this serve as lesson to you and to all who would forget the reverence owed to death and tradition." Gasps rippled through the crowd, though none protested. The punishment was harsh, but in Blackwood, respect for the dead was absolute. 2 guards, clad in leather armor, stepped forward. They seized Eleanor by the arms as she tried to step back. "Please. No. I'm sorry," she cried, but her voice was drowned out by the crowd's cold silence. Her feet scraped against the cobblestones as they dragged her toward the wooden platform at the center of the square. The platform was simple but feared. A tall wooden post stood at its center, ropes dangling from its sides, used often to discipline thieves or drunkards who brought shame upon the town. But never before had Eleanor imagined she would stand there herself. Her hands were bound tightly to the post, the rough rope biting into her wrists. Her braids slid over her shoulder as she hung her head, tears welling in her eyes. The villagers gathered closer, a ring of cloaked figures staring up at her. Some shook their heads in disappointment, others whispered in hushed voices. A few children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed with fear at what was to come. The guard chosen to administer the punishment stepped forward, a stout man with broad shoulders, carrying a long, thin cane of polished wood. He bowed slightly to the headman before turning to face Eleanor. Lord Cedric raised his hand. "Let the punishment be carried out." 10 strokes. The crowd held its breath. The guard lifted the cane, its wood gleaming in the gray light. Eleanor's eyes widened, her heart racing. "No, please," she whispered, but her voice cracked. The first strike cut through the air with a sharp whistle before landing across her back. The sound of the impact echoed, followed by Eleanor's gasp of pain. She clenched her fists, her body jerking against the ropes. Murmurs ran through the crowd. The second stroke fell, sharper than the first. Tears sprang from her eyes as she bit her lip to keep from crying out. The third and fourth followed swiftly, each burning her with humiliation as much as pain. By the fifth, she cried out, unable to hold back any longer. Her sobs filled the square, echoing off the stone walls of the church. Yet the punishment continued. The cane rose and fell, each strike a reminder of her foolish laughter, each lash a mark of her shame. The villagers watched in silence, their faces grim. Some looked away, unable to endure the sight of her suffering, while others nodded solemnly, believing justice was being served. By the 9th stroke, Eleanor's knees buckled, but the ropes held her upright. Her gown clung to her trembling frame, her braid messy, her cheeks wet with tears. The final 10th strike landed with a crack that seemed to shatter the silence itself. She cried out one last time before sagging against the post, her body quivering. The headman raised his hand again. "It is done." The ropes were loosened, and Eleanor collapsed to her knees, clutching her arms around herself. Her face burned with tears, shame heavier than the pain across her back. She dared not look up at the villagers, whose eyes still bore into her. The priest stepped forward, his voice solemn. "Let this be a reminder. Death is sacred. Tradition is sacred. To laugh at grief is to invite disgrace. May none forget this lesson." The widow of Rowan, though still grieving, gave a small nod, as if some justice had been served. Slowly, Eleanor rose, her body weak and trembling. She bowed her head low before the villagers, shame overwhelming her. "I am sorry," she whispered, though her voice barely carried beyond the platform. With that, she was led away, her steps slow, each one echoing with humiliation and regret. That night, as she lay on her straw bed, Eleanor wept quietly. Her back ached, her pride shattered, but the lesson seared itself into her heart. She understood now the weight of tradition, the depth of respect demanded in times of mourning. Never again would she take lightly the customs of her people. Never again would laughter escape her lips at the wrong time. The caning had marked her not just in body but in spirit. And so the story of Eleanor spread throughout Blackwood, carried on whispers and cautionary tales. Villagers would tell their children, "Remember Eleanor, who laughed at a funeral, and learned her lesson beneath the cane." And Eleanor herself, though humbled, bore her shame with a quiet resolve, forever changed by the day when laughter betrayed her, and the village made her pay.